Well, thank you, Bradley, and thank you all for coming. This bookstore is a great institution, and I've been here many times. I've spoken here many times, and my son used to be a barista here, as a matter of fact. So we have a lot of old ties to politics and prose, and. You know, I thought I would talk a little bit. There's so much to say about Scientology, but here I am in Washington, which has a unique role in Scientology, and I thought I'd talk a little bit about the history of how Washington plays into Scientology. L. Ron Hubbard was born in 1911. And when he was 12, his father was stationed here. His father was in the Navy. And so little Ron came through the Panama Canal with his family. And that was a memorable trip for him because on that ship there was a figure who would change his life. And his name was Lieutenant Commander Snake Thompson. Now, many people used to say that that man didn't really exist, but he did. He was a real figure, and he was part of his assignment in the Navy. He'd been a spy in Japan, and he was also a cat fancier. He was responsible for introducing Burmese cats. He was a fascinating figure. He actually trained cats, according to Hubbard, and he had a trained cat named Psycho, which... Anyway, young Ron Hubbard was on this ship coming through the Panama Canal on his way to Washington, and Snake Thompson had just been to Vienna to talk to Freud, and he was writing an account for the Navy. It had to do with you know, mental health of veterans and serving military personnel, and he had gone to Vienna to learn what he could from Freud, and he drummed some of this information into this very impressionable, avid young man. And so when they arrive in Washington, a couple of things happen. Hubbard is a Boy Scout. He claimed to be the youngest Eagle Scout ever, but regardless of his merits in that regard, he met Calvin Coolidge at the White House, and while he was here, he went to the Library of Congress, and he read up, he says, on Freud, and that Snake Thompson helped him through it. Well, that was a turning point in his career. It happened right here in Washington. When it's appropriate that we meet here also in a bookstore when we're talking about Scientology, because if there was ever, I mean, every movement in a way has a book behind it. You know, you can always dig through these movements and someone has written a book, has changed the world. For L. Ron Hubbard, that first world-shaking book was Dianetics, which came out in 1950. And it dominated the New York Times bestseller list in a way that I hope to emulate. But it so much so that it sort of set the category for self-help books. It became so popular after the war. And the theory of Dianetics is that you can heal yourself. You don't need to spend a whole lot of money. All you need to do is get at the root of your problems, which are in a section of your mind called the reactive mind. And there are buried all the fears and neuroses that have grown out of bad experiences that you've had in your lifetime. And if you can just recall them and lead them of their energy, then you will clear your reactive mind and rely entirely on your rational, analytical mind. And when you achieve that state, you will have gone clear. Well, as I said, that book sold millions of copies. And Hubbard made millions of dollars and lost them as well. He even lost control of the name Dianetics for a period of time. And he decided that there was another way I jumped ahead of myself. I missed a valuable part of Washington history. He went to JWU. His father wanted him to be an engineer. And he really wanted he had another life in mind for himself. He was president of the gliding club here at GWU, and he was quite an adventurous character. But he didn't finish GWU. He was a miserable student. He dropped out after 2 years, although he often claimed to have completed his education here in civil engineering. That really wasn't true. But he did go on to write Dianetics, and after that he invented a religion, and it's called Scientology. Well, what is Scientology exactly? There's a lot to know about it. It's a very eccentric worldview created by a writer whose specialty was science fiction. And so there are many elements in Scientology that sound like science fiction because they were written by somebody who had written very similar things in much of his fiction. In Scientology, the idea is that you are an immortal soul. In Scientology, that is called a thetan. And you've lived before, and you'll live again. What Scientology can help you do is remember those past lifetimes and achieve your salvation. This is good news to a lot of people. And in the course of therapy that Scientology has is called auditing. The auditor, between you and your auditor, there's a device, and it's called an e-meter. 2 cans, you hold 2 cans. In the old days, there used to be Campbell's soup cans with the labels scraped off. There are wires connecting it to a meter, and there's a small amount of electricity passing through those wires. It's 1/3 of an actual lie detector. It measures your galvanic skin responses. It doesn't measure your pulse or your respiration, but it does do something. And so when you're talking to your auditor, the needle is constantly registering. Now, in Scientology, they think that it measures the mass of your thoughts. They think thoughts have mass, and you can see the movement as they disaggregate. Say an old painful memory might show up on the meter, and if you continually go through this thought and drain it of its painful qualities, then the needle will slow down, and pretty soon it no longer affects your behavior. If you have that happen to you, the next thing might be you would be asked, there's an earlier event in your life that was like that? Say it was an argument with your wife. Was there some other moment in your life that resembles that moment? And you might say, yes, my mother once said the same thing to me when I was about 10. I will never forget it. Well, that's a vivid memory, and let's talk about it. And pretty soon it calms down, and you go back further and further. And one of the things that happened during the period of time that Hubbard moved again to Washington, D.C. in 1957, living right around in DuPont Circle, I'm sure that many of you have noted one of the historic churches of Scientology, right in one of the most beautiful buildings in this neighborhood, was one of the original churches of Scientology, and he and his family lived right around the corner. So much of his theology was invented here. If during that period of time, people began to have memories in the womb. This was a controversial experiment in the history of Scientology. Could you really remember that far back? Could you remember arguments that your parents had while they were having intercourse or something like that? Because people were producing such memories. And then they began to have memories even further back of previous lifetimes. Hubbard himself began to resist that, but eventually he endorsed it wholeheartedly. Now, let's imagine you've had that argument with your spouse. You remember the argument with your mother. Now you suddenly in your auditing you might have an image, and the auditor will say, "What's that? Stop right there. What is that memory?" "Well, I don't know. I just had an image of a farmhouse." "Well, look around. What do you see?" You might say, well, I see horses, straw, you know. Well, open the door and walk outside. What do you see? Well, it looks like what I imagine France would look like in the 17th century. Well, bear in mind, the e-meter might be saying, this is true. This is real. And if you believe that, it adds validity to this image that is then amplified into what feels like a real memory. And that becomes a past life. And for many people, this is as real and valid as other real memories that they've had of their current existence. But think how important that would be, that knowledge that, yes, I did live again, and therefore I am immortal. Another thing that happens oftentimes in these circumstances is that people have the experience of leaving their body. In Scientology, it's called going exterior. They sense that they have floated away. They can look around behind them. They can go to other planets. Now, I'm not trying to denigrate the experiences that people have in Scientology or other religions. But if you've had such an experience, what other people say about Scientology, the criticism that they might launch against the church, isn't going to really reach them. They've had a transforming experience. They've gotten information that they find very valuable in their lives, and what you say really isn't going to reach them. Now, there are a couple of questions that people often ask me, and I'm going to treat them kind of quickly, but I think they are important. One is, was Hubbard crazy? He's often seen that way, and he did have concerns that he expressed about his own mental health. He actually wrote to the Veterans Administration for some assistance, and for some kind of psychological assistance, and he never actually, we don't have any record that he ever got that. And many people have given me their diagnoses. Some professionals have weighed in with terms like malignant narcissism, paranoid schizophrenia. You know, and he certainly, if you look at his behavior and his thinking, he does show signs of a lot of these things. But I think nobody in history has ever mapped his own mentality quite as carefully as L. Ron Hubbard, meticulously examining every detail. Just as a writer, and here we are in our bookstore, I have to take my hat off to him. He holds the Guinness Book of World Records for the number of titles he published, more than 1,000. So he continually wrote, and mostly what he wrote about in Scientology was his own interior journey. And that is what Scientology really is. And when you enter the Church of Scientology, it's like a breadcrumb trail into his mind. The further you go into the church, the deeper into L. Ron Hubbard's mind you go. On the crazy question, though, one way I look at L. Ron Hubbard, if we were in another culture, say an Aboriginal culture, anthropologists sometimes talk of schizophrenia as being the shaman disease. People who have, these experiences, sometimes in our culture we would say they're crazy and they need to be on medication. But in other cultures and in other times, people who have had extraordinary mental breakdowns or journeys come back and feel like they have healed themselves, and they are the people that people go to be healed. Their mission is to heal their friends and their community. I think L. Ron Hubbard somehow saw himself that way. He had a theory of his life that he propagated as the truth. He said that he was a heroic veteran of World War II. He said that after the war he was so badly injured that he was blinded and crippled, and that medicine couldn't help him. And so he developed his own techniques of healing, and those are the techniques that evolved into Dianetics and then became the root of Scientology. Well, the record shows that he was never injured in the war. He did have conjunctivitis, but there was nothing seriously wrong with him. But the idea of the shaman's journey is buried in the legend that he created about himself. Now, was he a con man? This is probably the most common perception of L. Ron Hubbard. I think that if he really were a con man, at some point in his life he would have taken the money and run. He never did that. He spent his entire existence, for the most part, alone with those cans in his hand, staring at the meter, trying to find what was going on inside this vast universe inside his mind. That was how he passed all of his time, in creating bureaucracy to support this amazing theology that he had come up with. Now, L. Ron Hubbard died 27 years ago today. He was succeeded by a young man named David Miscavige, who was 25 years old when Hubbard died, and he was not the designated successor. He shoved aside his competitors and ruthlessly took control of the church. His one great legacy, of David Miscavige, also took place here. When L. Ron Hubbard died, he had made a decision to not pay his taxes for the Church of Scientology. And by 1993, the church owed $1 billion to the IRS. It didn't have $1 billion. It was an existential moment. The church had to get a tax exemption. And in order to do that, it had to get the IRS to recognize it as a religion. And there's only one agency in the country that can determine whether you are a religion or not, and that is the IRS. An organization very ill-equipped to make such distinctions. So how did the Church of Scientology go about acquiring that exemption? Well, they began by launching a series of lawsuits against the IRS, 2,400 against the IRS and individual agents. They hired private detectives to follow agents. They even followed them to conventions and to see who was drinking too much or fooling around on the road. And they would write about those episodes in their own magazine. So intimidation, forceful responses to the IRS. And the IRS was brought to its knees. It was really overwhelmed by this cascade of lawsuits. But there was the problem the church still had. It owed $1 billion. So both of these entities were at loggerheads. And one day, David Miscavige was here. He's the current head of the church now. And he was having lunch with Gerald Pfeffer, who's one of the attorneys here in Washington, along with his wife, Monique Yingling, who represent the Church of Scientology. And they were having lunch at the Bombay Club. And Miscavige was with his deputy, Marty Rathbun, and he suddenly said to Pfeffer, "Look, I've had enough of this. Marty and I are going to go over to the IRS and talk to Fred Goldberg, the IRS commissioner, right now." And the lawyers were kind of stunned. But indeed, they jumped in a cab and they went to 1111 Constitution Avenue and walked in and said, "We're from the Church of Scientology and we want to see the commissioner." Well, the commissioner wasn't really available that very moment, but he quickly was. They had an interest in getting this resolved as well. Now, there may be good merit for the reason the IRS made the distinction that the Church of Scientology is a bona fide religion. I don't know. I mean, I don't know what standards they use to determine a religion. But in any case, the circumstances, the trade-off was that the suits stopped and the exemption was granted. And once that happened, the vast privileges and protections of the First Amendment guarantees of religion surrounded the Church of Scientology and protected it until this day. So those events all took place in Washington, D.C., and I thought I would just give you a little bit of historical background before inviting you to respond with some questions. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Good evening. Thank you so much for coming. Can you speculate as to the future for David Miscavige? He seems to be such an abusive person to several of the, the people in hierarchy and several of his ordinary people that have helped him for so many years. Can you speculate?
Yes, I'd be happy to talk about that. I'm not the first to talk about this, but I've had 12 people tell me that David Miscavige physically assaulted them. I have more than 20 witnesses. He wasn't the only one inside the church that was beating people up, but he was the head of the church and a church. And it's quite remarkable to think that that kind of behavior can go on. Moreover, people that were, some of the people who were beaten and others were confined. There are re-education camps, they're called Rehabilitation Project Force, or RPF, in different locations. But especially in this desert compound in Southern California called the Gold Base, which is where the Sea Org, the clergy of Scientology, has its headquarters, a 500-acre compound. And on that compound, there are 2 double-wide trailers that are married together. And at one point, Miscavige decided that he was going to start sending some of his top-level executives there for kind of re-education. And all the furniture was taken out. They slept on the floor on sleeping bags. They were only allowed out once a day for a shower in the garage. And during that period of time, they're supposed to query each other about what their crimes are, what's going wrong. Well, I'll tell you what went wrong inside that. There was a lot of physical confrontation. There was a lot of abuse. More than 100 people at one point. Really, the entire top tier of Scientology management was confined in this. This has gone on for years. Like the nominal president of the church, Hubbard, an elderly gentleman. And my friend John Burnett could tell you stories about having interviewed him years ago. But he's, perhaps because of the way he treated John, he's been locked up for 7 years. Now, I speak as an amateur here about tax law, but my understanding of a 501c3 is that, at least the one that the church was given, there are layers of accountability. There has to be responsibility along the line. One entity is accountable to the next. But when you have one individual who can put all the other individuals into a double-wide trailer for years on end, I don't know that you can say that there's any other individual than David Miscavige who has any power inside the Church of Scientology. I think the church is at a crisis point in its future. And if it is headed for a reckoning, and if David Miscavige is not willing to come forward and confront his accusers, then people in the church have a responsibility, I think a moral responsibility, to address those abuses. And I particularly charge the celebrities who have been used to promote Scientology with that duty, because nobody else has done more to bring people into Scientology. They have a definite responsibility to understand what's going on there. Thank you.
Thank you.
In 1989, the U.S. Supreme Court in Hernandez versus the IRS ruled that the basic form of fundraising, the fixed donation, was not a income tax deductible item. In October of 1993, Fred Goldberg, evidently it's been alleged independently of the exempt organization of the IRS, which normally gave tax exemptions, overruled the U.S. Supreme Court and gave them that tax deduction. How in the world can the IRS overrule a judgment of the U.S. Supreme Court?
Well, you're obviously better qualified to answer that than I. But one thing I would say, you know, when they gave that exemption, they also awarded the church the power to determine which of its own entities are tax exempt. And I've been seeking that power myself. Another thing that they have is that, you know, Hubbard wrote innumerable novels. Those are also tax exempt. They have nothing to do with the church's scripture, but according to the IRS, this capacious judgment that was given to the church, all of that falls under the jurisdiction of religious literature.
Well, Heber Jensch, before he disappeared, had indicated against, evidently publicly, that they had spent $1 million in investigating the IRS before that was given.
Yeah.
Who follows up on something like that? Where in the structure do we follow up with something like that?
Well, you know, I think that, first of all, when you have a situation like that, it's an ideal place for an investigative reporter to go in and say, now what gives here? You know, that I had many of the same questions that everybody has about Scientology. I think the windows need to be opened. And I've tried as much as I possibly can to crack them open. I got very little cooperation from the church itself. But I think awareness in the public and demands of public officials that we know more about it are called for. Yes, sir. Oh, Emily, please.
Have you personally been intimidated by Scientology? This may be apocryphal, you may know. I heard that probably 15, 20 years ago, a Time reporter who wrote a big story for them had to change his name because his life became so intolerable. I know they prevented fear prevented the publication of your book in England. And my second part of my question is, you know, with this talking about people being people disappearing and being held against their will, where is the Justice Department? Why isn't another branch of government looking into?
Let's see if I can go through. You'll have to remind me if I don't hit every point here. But on I just had innumerable legal letters. I'm not intimidated by them. You know, my last book was about Al Qaeda, but. One thing I've learned, you know, Al Qaeda doesn't have any lawyers, and if they did, they'd be a really dangerous organization. The UK, yes, it's true. My British publisher backed out, and it shows several things. One is that my American publisher, Alfred A. Knopf, has a lot of courage and is willing to withstand all these kind of shots across the bow that we've been receiving. And I'm very grateful to have that kind of support. I've been asked by PEN, the International Writers Organization, to go to Britain and talk to members of Parliament and the Minister of Justice about their libel laws, which are foreclose, in many cases, the flow of information to people who might really need the information about an organization that could be very dangerous. So I understand the stance of the Brits on this kind of thing, but we're going to try to do what we can to change it. And I am hoping to find another British publisher who's willing to do that. Now, was there something else, Emily, that I... Oh, okay. While I was doing my story for the New Yorker, I stumbled over an FBI investigation, and their line of attack was human trafficking. Typically, this has to do with prostitution or something, you know, but in this case, 2 FBI agents in the LA office who specialized in human trafficking were looking into the gold base and what the circumstances, you know, people being held against their will, children being recruited into that organization at really young ages and taken out of school and pushed into heavy service and impoverished by their service. These are all questions the FBI had. But the court ruled in one of the notable lawsuits that these are religious practices. And this is religious discipline in the terms of the church. And the FBI ran up a white flag. So, but they got as far, according to one of my sources, they were thinking of doing a raid on the gold base, which is a pretty, you know, I mean, it's got high fences and motion detectors, and it's, you know, pretty formidable. But they were going to break in and go into the hole and open the door and liberate everyone. And some of my, and they got so far to think that David Miscavige would try to escape in Tom Cruise's airplane. So they got the tail numbers on Tom Cruise's airplane to make sure he didn't get away. But what my sources told the FBI, if you were to break open and open the doors of the hole and say you're free, people would say we're here of our own will. And that's why the subtitle of this book is The Prison of Belief, because it's their will that holds them there more than any other thing. Yes, sir.
I was wondering if in your research you came across a dollar amount that Hubbard set out of what would be needed to defeat Lord Zeno. Like, it seems that there's always money coming in, but it doesn't go anywhere.
Well, you know, there is a lot of money in Scientology. When Hubbard left the church, they didn't have that much money. He had a lot of money. I mean, you know, a lot of money was transferred to his individual accounts. But you know, when they had that huge liability to the IRS, they just didn't have that much money in their coffers. Now they do. They do have, according to former members, $1 billion in liquid assets and offshore accounts. Now, the IRS, I mean, the Catholic Church would have a hard time coming up with $1 billion in cash. That's a lot of money for a small organization. It's a testament to the devotion of the members and the avidity of the fundraisers in that church to be able to amass that amount of money. Whether or not they have money or, you know, lawyers, and as they have, what they really need is members. And the future of the church is going to depend on its ability to actually bring people into the church. And I think in that regard, they're really failing.
Very interesting. I wanted to know, are there other movie stars other than Tom Cruise that have become involved in this? And any thoughts as to why movie stars might be attracted to? And many years ago, growing up in another country, I had a friend whose brother disappeared into a ship, a boat. It was, you know, I don't. Do people still disappear into this organization? And is there no legislation at all to try to stop these characters?
Let me start with the ship. In the mid-'60s, Hubbard created a little Scientology armada. And they sailed the Mediterranean and then the Caribbean. And the young people that he hired to be their crew, you know, young Scientologists, were called the Sea Org, the Sea Organization, or, you know, but that became the clergy. And if your friend went into that, he probably became a member of the Sea Org, and may have gotten closeted in one of their compounds, and they're not encouraged to deal with the outside world. So that might be what happened. Now, as for celebrities, the Church of Scientology was designed for celebrities. It was founded in Los Angeles. The Celebrity Center is there in Hollywood. It's one of the major landlords in all of Hollywood. And early on, the church published a list of prospective celebrities for the Church of Scientology. Hubbard wanted exemplary figures who would be pitchmen for his religion. And the names on the list were like Bob Hope, Walt Disney, Marlene Dietrich. I mean, you know, there's a long list of the, you know, some of the most notable people in America in the 50s. And people did go in. Gloria Swanson, for instance, the former silent movie star, who then came back in such glory in Sunset Boulevard. But she joined Church of Scientology. Rock Hudson made a brief appearance in the church in those early days. There are some other names that are not as current today, but Stephen Boyd and so on, Karen Black. But the big fish, the one that would be the transforming figure, eluded capture. The first of the biggest fish was John Travolta. And his is an exemplary story in itself. He was a young, troubled young actor who was doing his first movie in Mexico. And he became friends with an actress, and she decided to give him a copy of Dianetics. She was in Scientology herself, and she gave him some Dianetic therapy, and he went exterior. He had an out-of-body experience. This really made a huge impression on him. And then when he came back to Los Angeles, he started taking courses at the Celebrity Center. And one day he told his teacher that he was trying out for a role in Welcome Back, Kotter. And so the teacher had everybody in the class, if you can imagine you're the class, orient themselves towards ABC Studios and telepathically send the message, John Travolta is right for the part. And he got the part. So after that, he always said that Scientology put him in the big time. I have some concerns about, as Travolta brings up a story that I think is also an important one to understand. One of my sources is a delightful woman named Spanky Taylor. She joined the church when she was a young teenager, and because of her charm and her bubbly nature, she was assigned to help young actors. And one of the young actors was John Travolta, who was just beginning to have this burst of fame. And it was hard for him to handle. And Spanky helped him through that emotional, difficult period. And his mother died, and you know, he really leaned on her. Now Spanky had a little girl, and she was pregnant, and a friend of hers was dying, and she felt that the church wasn't taking good care of her, and she got angry, and she was sent to this RPF thing in this old hospital that's on the edge of Hollywood, a big blue building that many of you have seen with a big yellow sign of Scientology on it that looms over the district. It's an old hospital, as I said, and there were so many people crowded into the old patient rooms by the dozen that Spanky was put up on the roof with a soggy mattress. She's pregnant. She's eating slop out of a bucket. She's in Hollywood. She's, look around. You can see Sunset Boulevard and all this sort of thing. Just imagine the contrast. And her baby is taken from her to a Scientology child care place where there's only one woman overlooking dozens of children. At one point, Spanky went over to see her baby Vanessa, and Vanessa had whooping cough, and her crib was soaking wet, and her eyes were glued shut with mucus, and Spanky thought she could die. Moreover, since she was pregnant and she was losing weight, she thought she'd lose her baby as well. So she was really, really scared. And at this point, members of the church came to her and asked if she could get a print of Saturday Night Fever from Travolta. And the deal was, she agreed to call Travolta's assistant, and he said he would give her the print. It was the only copy left. It was his personal copy. But the deal was he hadn't heard from her for months. And he didn't know what was wrong with her. But I think he must have suspected. He said, the deal is I want to have dinner with you. So, okay, the Scientology executives agree to the deal. They get the print. They show the movie. And then she's taken and forced to call Travolta and break the date. And he sent her flowers that were taken up to her in the RPF. But I have to say, what did he know? What did he know about his friend who had taken care of him? She finally made an escape. calling Travolta's assistant to come pick her up as she was going to supposedly take her daughter for medical treatment, and then she jumped in the car and fled. But I still wonder, you know, when people like John Travolta and Tom Cruise and others stand up and say what a great place Scientology is, if they remember those occasions, if they acknowledge the kind of abuses that are taking place right under their noses.
Hi. Thank you for being here. You're fascinating. I love your writing.
Thank you.
My question is twofold. Number one is, why aren't there any police reports, like this other woman asked about, all the abuse? When people get on the free winds, they take their passports away, so they don't have any money, they can't escape, they have nowhere to go. There was a show on TV this week about a pregnant woman who was forced to actually live in a parking garage while she was pregnant.
Yeah.
Why don't these people, after they defect, why don't they report this? And number two, why do people stay even though they're mistreated?
Well, these two questions are tied together. And let me put you in the mind frame of someone who, say someone who has been abused on this gold base in the desert compound. And it could be that if you're that person, suppose you joined, like many of these people, when you were a child. Or maybe you were born into it. Let's say that probably, you know, many of your family members, maybe all of them, are members of the church. Your whole society is composed of people like you in the Scientology and probably in the Sea Org. And you don't have any education to speak of. Yeah, you're impoverished. You're paid $50 a week. When you become a member of the Sea Org, you're given 2 shirts and 2 pair of pants, and that's your lifetime allotment. So everything that you know, all of your other needs, you know, come out of that money. So you don't have very much contact with the outside world. You're taught to be very suspicious of it. Non-Scientologists in Scientology are called wogs. It's an old ethnic slur that the Brits had for South Asians, but Hubbard adopted it for non-Scientologists. And wog justice is one of those things that you would never do. Now, if you say you've been physically abused, or some other reason would cause you to want to leave the church, you could go through the front door. It would mean turning your back on all of your family and friends into a society that you're very ill-equipped to go into. But if you did make that choice, you would also be given a bill. It's called a freeloaders tab. And it's a bill for all the services you might have been getting during that period of time or whatever else they want to add into it. And typically this is hundreds of thousands of dollars. You know, your bank account probably is not that flush. And you're also made to sign a confession of crimes that you supposedly committed. And in case you ever say anything against the church, they'll have this document, as I've seen such documents, to be used against you. If you decide, on the other hand, to just simply run away, and you're able to get outside of the gate and actually escape, as a number of people I've talked to have been able to, they'll go after you and try to bring you back. And the ways, and I talked to the guy that was in charge of that, they call it the blow drill. It's really chilling. They're able to call airlines and persuade them that they are relatives in medical emergencies and find out what flight you're on. They'll send people out to sit outside your relatives' houses and monitor them. You know, they're very, I mean, it's out in the desert, so, you know, they usually get you before you get very far. But one guy, they know so much about you. You know, they got all your financial information, everything you have to confess. But one guy, what really got him is that he was well known for his love for baseball, and they picked him up in the San Francisco Giants parking lot. So you can see that this is a totalistic universe, and it's very difficult to break away. Yes, sir.
Let me unite 2 themes. One is follow the money, and the need for plaintiffs who are inside who want to bring suit. And just recently, a couple in named the Garcias, filed suit in district court in Florida for fraud for $400,000, naming the various Scientology organizations as well as Miscavige by name this way, and supposedly with some contractual basis for their suit. To what extent would this be a way for the organization to face a new reality, where it's not, an individual simply trying to break free, but someone going after the money, something which is important to Scientology and Miscavige?
Well, as I said earlier, this is an organization that's really lawyered up. And I talked to one of the lawyers who created the architecture, the bureaucratic architecture of Scientology, and there's so many discrete compartments that it's impossible to break the bank. Each one of them is isolated from the other. And I met Luis Garcia and his wife, and I wish them well. But I think it's a formidable task to take down Scientology. It has to take itself down. It has to, if somebody inside, there aren't really, the reason I take on the celebrities and assign them this responsibility is the other executives are so cowed and, have been locked up for such a long periods of time. They have no power. The only power that anybody has in the Church of Scientology to really affect change are those front men that you constantly see. And they're the ones that I charge with changing that church.
How much fidelity is there in the portrayal in the movie The Master and the processes that go on in the church?
Well, I love The Master. A lot of people don't agree with me, and maybe it is very obscure, and maybe because of my reading so much of L. Ron Hubbard's works, it was more interesting to me than some. I thought the performances were really compelling. And I thought Philip Seymour Hoffman was a very plausible reincarnation of L. Ron Hubbard in many respects, and you could kind of see the charisma and the contradictions in his personality that make Hubbard such a charismatic and compelling figure, a really great figure to write about. There were actually bits of dialogue in the movie that are in my book, not that I wrote, but that someone else, sources that I used that turned up in the lips of some of the characters in that movie. So yes, there was fidelity in that way, but it's elusive. It doesn't intend to be an exact depiction of the Church of Scientology, but just the allure of powerful personality like that. Yes.
Are you aware of any meaningful, serious efforts to challenge the 501c3 exemption or maybe an aggressive state to
No, I am not.
My question is about a set of abuses or alleged abuses that you mention in your book. You say that the Scientology organization does not believe that its Sea Org leadership, women should have babies. But it denies to you that it's ever pressured any pregnant woman to have an abortion. But your book also says that numbers of pregnant women have said to you and to others that they have been pressured by the Scientology organization to have abortions that they didn't want to have.
Right.
So can you explain how specific are the allegations of the pressure on the one hand, and how specific are the denials as to the particular contentions, and have you drawn a conclusion?
Well, I've talked to a lot of women that said that they had abortions and that they were told to have abortions, and men who said their wives, were pushed to have abortions. It's not just women that feel the loss. And some of those people are out now and will never have families. They missed that opportunity. So it's a really tragic thing. But the leverage that the church uses. It used to be there were children in Scientology. There used to be on board ship. They caused a lot of trouble. And Hubbard had a theory that children are not different from adults. They're just small. And therefore they should be treated as you would treat an adult. And so when a child misbehaved, he came up with one of his punishments was to put them in the chain locker. That's where the anchor chain is stored, and it's cold and dark and dank, and they would be fed, but they were not allowed out to go to the bathroom or go to sleep or anything. They were just put in there for days, and some of them for weeks. And he actually put a deaf girl down there to hope that she would regain her hearing. So the treatment of children became a huge issue early on, and finally it was decided we can't have them. We can't have kids here, because they had a ranch for children, and the children essentially built their own dormitories and gave themselves schooling and so on. Very, very little adult supervision. So it came to pass that the decision was made, no more kids, which meant that if you get pregnant, you have a choice. You can leave the Sea Org with all the consequences that I told you about, losing your ties to your families and so on, and having very little to look forward to, and the sense of losing your eternal salvation. Or you could watch out of the Sea Org and be sent off to some remote location as a staff member. In the face of that, a lot of people chose to have the abortion. And what they do is they go to county health in Riverside County and charge it to the taxpayers.
My question is whether the allegations of pressure to have the abortion or to get your wife to have the abortion, are they specific? Do they mention time and place and how about the denials? Are they specific that either that person was not in Scientology or the wife wasn't in Scientology or the person doing the pressure wasn't? Are they specific?
The allegations of the abortions are individual, person by person. They, women or husbands would tell me, this happened to me, and there you see sometimes in court suits where they've specified dates like that. The church's response is categorical. We don't do that. You're welcome.
Larry, we have time for 2 more.
I've read a couple of your articles and another book about Scientology. Looking forward to reading your book in whole, but Miscavige comes across as a terribly malevolent figure, including the way he pushed his way to leadership. But my question is, has he really denatured Scientology in an evil way, or is what he's doing very much a follow-on from the principles instilled by L. Ron Hubbard?
Well, David Miscavige and L. Ron Hubbard are different in one way, which is that David Miscavige grew up in Scientology and L. Ron Hubbard did not. You can't say that David Miscavige is not a creation of Scientology because he joined it when he was a young teenager. He joined the Sea Org when he was 16 after dropping out of high school. His entire adult life and most of his entire life has been lived inside this organization. So he is a manifestation of it. Although many ex-members think that he has taken the church away from the original teachings of L. Ron Hubbard. Every religion faces an existential moment when the founder dies. And whether it's Brigham Young or Paul after Christ or whoever is going to, either the religion is going to survive because of the successor, or it's going to perish because the charismatic founder is now gone. David Miscavige did save Scientology when he got the tax exemption, and the church would not exist if it weren't for that. However, the church is in disarray now, and in part because of the behavior that he's exhibited according to many of my sources. So I think that it is now time for the church to examine those. Thank you. Last question.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you could talk about their hatred of psychiatry and the things they've done involving that.
The psychiatry, you could say the psychiatry drives them nuts. L. Ron Hubbard, when he wrote Dianetics, he was under the illusion that he was going to be acclaimed by the American Psychological Association and the American Psychiatric Association. He sent the manuscript to them for their imprimatur, and they laughed at him. You know, in the viewpoint of scientists, this is like psychological folk art. You know, who would take this seriously? You know, what are these studies that he's citing, but there's no evidence that they actually exist? And his intuition that he drew upon to imagine human behavior was something that in the field of psychiatry was seen as incredibly naive and disturbing. So ever after that, Hubbard took no opportunity, left no opportunity to attack psychiatry. But it was more than that. He alleges that psychiatry is at the root of all human ills. And everything, terrorism, racism, genocide, psychiatrists are behind it. When Tom Cruise jumped down Matt Lauer's throat about Brooke Shields and said, "You don't know the history of psychiatry, Matt, I do," what he's referring to is that. He's referring to Hubbard's belief that 4 trillion years ago, which is in the Scientology calendar about when the universe began, psychiatrists were there. And you know, when Xenu, the evil galactic overlord, who is responsible for so much the damage, he was surrounded by psychiatrists, and they came up with a plan to because they were overpopulated in the galaxy at the time, to bring in the surplus population, supposedly for tax audits. Freeze them, send them in rocket ships that resemble DC-3s to the prison planet TGAC, which is Earth, and drop them in volcanoes and blow them up with nuclear bombs, and then capture their disembodied spirits and re-educate those spirits by putting them in front of movie screens and showing them images of England and thoughts about Jesus and the Catholic Church and so on. And so that's where we all kind of come from. But it's psychiatrists that are behind all this. So in brief, that's the relationship of the Church of Scientology and psychiatry. Thank you very much.
For more information, visit the author's website, lawrencewright.com.
You would be asked, there's an earlier event in your life that was like that? Say it was an argument with your wife. Was there some other moment in your life that resembles that moment? And you might say, yes, my mother once said the same thing to me when I was about 10. I will never forget it. Well, that's a vivid memory, and let's talk about it. And pretty soon it calms down, and you go back further and further. And one of the things that happened during the period of time that Hubbard moved again to Washington, D.C. in 1957, living right around in DuPont Circle, I'm sure that many of you have noted one of the historic churches of Scientology, right in one of the most beautiful buildings in this neighborhood, was one of the original churches of Scientology, and he and his family lived right around the corner. So much of his theology was invented here. If during that period of time, people began to have memories in the womb. This was a controversial experiment in the history of Scientology. Could you really remember that far back? Could you remember arguments that your parents had while they were having intercourse or something like that? Because people were producing such memories. And then they began to have memories even further back of previous lifetimes. Hubbard himself began to resist that. But eventually, he endorsed it wholeheartedly. Now, let's imagine you've had that argument with your spouse. You remember the argument with your mother. Now you suddenly in your auditing you might have an image, and the auditors in Scientology that sound like science fiction because they were written by somebody who had written very similar things in much of his fiction. In Scientology, the idea is that you are an immortal soul. In Scientology, that is called a thetan. And you've lived before, and you'll live again. What Scientology can help you do is remember those past lifetimes and achieve your salvation. This is good news to a lot of people. And in the course of therapy that the Scientology has is called auditing. The auditor, between you and your auditor, there's a device, and it's called an e-meter. 2 cans. You hold 2 cans. In the old days, there used to be Campbell's soup cans with the labels scraped off. There are wires connecting it to a meter, and there's a small amount of electricity passing through those wires. It's 1/3 of an actual lie detector. It measures your galvanic skin responses. It doesn't measure your pulse or your respiration, but it does do something. And so when you're talking to your auditor, the needle is constantly registering. Now, in Scientology, they think that it measures the mass of your thoughts. They think thoughts have mass, and you can see the movement as they disaggregate. Say an old painful memory might show up on the meter, and if you continually go through this thought and drain it of its painful qualities, then the needle will slow down, and pretty soon it no longer affects your behavior. If you have that happen to you, the next thing might be well, thank you, Bradley, and thank you all for coming. This bookstore is a great institution, and I've been here many times. I've spoken here many times, and my son used to be a barista here, as a matter of fact. So we have a lot of old ties to politics and prose. And you know, I thought I would talk a little bit. There's so much to say about Scientology, but here I am in Washington, which has a unique role in Scientology, and I thought I'd talk a little bit about the history of how Washington plays into Scientology. L. Ron Hubbard was born in 1911, and when he was 12, his father was stationed here. His father was in the Navy, and so little Ron came through the Panama Canal with his family. And that was a memorable trip for him because on that ship there was a figure who would change his life, and his name was Lieutenant Commander Snake Thompson. Now, many people used to say that that man didn't really exist, but he did. He was a real figure, and he was part of his assignment in the Navy. He'd been a spy in Japan, and he was also a cat fancier. He was responsible for introducing Burmese cats. He was a fascinating figure. He actually trained cats, according to Hubbard, and he had a trained cat named Psycho, which... Anyway, young Ron Hubbard was on this ship coming through the Panama Canal on his way to Washington, and Snake Thompson had just been to Vienna to talk to Freud, and he was writing an account for the Navy. It had to do with you know, mental health of veterans and serving military personnel, and he had gone to Vienna to learn what he could from Freud, and he drummed some of this information into this very impressionable, avid young man. And so when they arrive in Washington, a couple of things happen. Hubbard is a Boy Scout. He claimed to be the youngest Eagle Scout ever. But regardless of his merits in that regard, he met Calvin Coolidge at the White House, and while he was here, he went to the Library of Congress, and he read up, he says, on Freud, and that Snake Thompson helped him through it. Well, that was a turning point in his career. It happened right here in Washington. When it's appropriate that we meet here also in a bookstore when we're talking about Scientology, because if there was ever, I mean, every movement in a way has a book behind it. You know, you can always dig through these movements and someone has written a book, has changed the world. For L. Ron Hubbard, that first world-shaking book was Dianetics, which came out in 1950. And it dominated the New York Times bestseller list in a way that I hope to emulate. But it so much so that it sort of set the category for self-help books. It became so popular after the war. And the theory of Dianetics is that you can heal yourself. You don't need to spend a whole lot of money. All you need to do is get at the root of your problems, which are in a section of your mind called the reactive mind. And there are buried all the fears and neuroses that have grown out of bad experiences that you've had in your lifetime. And if you can just recall them and lead them of their energy, then you will clear your reactive mind and rely entirely on your rational, analytical mind. And when you achieve that state, you will have gone clear. Well, as I said, that book sold millions of copies. And Hubbard made millions of dollars and lost them as well. He even lost control of the name Dianetics for a period of time. And he decided that there was another way I jumped ahead of myself. I missed a valuable part of Washington history. He went to JWU. His father wanted him to be an engineer. And he really wanted he had another life in mind for himself. He was president of the gliding club here at GWU, and he was quite an adventurous character. But he didn't finish GWU. He was a miserable student. He dropped out after 2 years, although he often claimed to have completed his education here in civil engineering. That really wasn't true. But he did go on to write Dianetics, and after that he invented a religion, and it's called Scientology. Well, what is Scientology exactly? There's a lot to know about it. It's a very eccentric worldview created by a writer whose specialty was science fiction. And so there are many elements